Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The name itself sounds rather grand, doesn't it? It sort of summons images of dusty libraries, stern-looking portraits, and, well, books so dense they could probably stop a bullet. For many, Hegel is the Mount Everest of philosophy. He is a peak so intimidating that most people prefer to admire it from a safe distance, maybe with a nice cup of tea and a biscuit. His writing is notoriously difficult, a labyrinth of jargon and complex sentences that seem to twist back on themselves. It's almost as if he wanted to make sure only the most determined readers would ever uncover the treasures hidden within his prose. He is, in short, a bit of a brain teaser. And yet, it is quite impossible to understand the last 2 centuries of thought without grappling with this formidable German thinker. His ideas have cast an extraordinarily long shadow over everything that came after him. From politics to art, from theology to psychology, his fingerprints are everywhere. Trying to navigate modern philosophy without bumping into Hegel is like trying to discuss physics without mentioning Newton or Einstein. He fundamentally changed the questions we ask and the way we think about history, consciousness, and freedom. He is the ghost in the machine of modern thought, a presence that is felt even by those who have never read a single word he wrote. So, who was this man, this philosophical titan? Born in Stuttgart in 1770, he lived through a period of immense turmoil and change in Europe. The French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, the dawn of the Industrial Age, these were the dramatic backdrops to his life's work. He wasn't a philosopher who locked himself away in an ivory tower, detached from the world. Instead, he saw the turbulent events unfolding around him as part of a grand rational story. He believed that history itself was a kind of philosophical argument, and that by understanding its logic, we could understand the very nature of reality itself. Our journey, then, is to demystify this intellectual giant. We will attempt to peek behind the curtain of his complex language and see the powerful ideas at play. It's a challenge, to be sure, but a rewarding one. We will see how he took the philosophical baton from his predecessors and ran with it, creating a system of thought so comprehensive that it aimed to explain, well, everything. We will explore his famous dialectical method, his views on history as the story of freedom, and the staggering influence he had on his friends and, perhaps more entertainingly, his enemies. So, let's take a deep breath and step into Hegel's world. It's quite an interesting place. To understand Hegel, we must first talk about the man who set the stage for him, Immanuel Kant. Before Kant, philosophers were generally split into 2 camps. You had the rationalists, who believed you could figure everything out just by thinking hard, and the empiricists, who argued that all knowledge comes from what we see and touch. Kant, with his typically German thoroughness, came along and said, "Hold on, you're both a bit right and a bit wrong." He proposed that our minds aren't just passive sponges soaking up the world. Instead, our minds actively shape how we experience reality through innate categories like space, time, and causality. We can never know the thing in itself, the noumenon, only the world as it appears to us, the phenomenon. This was a philosophical earthquake, and it created a huge new problem. If we are forever cut off from the true reality of the thing in itself, how can we know anything for certain? This is where the German idealists who followed Kant came in. They looked at the gap Kant had created between our minds and reality and decided to close it. The first major figure to take a crack at this was Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Fichte essentially argued that the only reality we can be sure of is our own consciousness, the I or the ego. He suggested that the entire world, the not I, is something posited or set up by the ego as a sort of challenge for it to overcome, allowing it to achieve self-awareness and freedom. Next up was Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who was actually Hegel's roommate at university. Schelling looked at Fichte's ideas and thought they were a bit too focused on the human mind. What about nature? Schelling proposed that the same spiritual or mental force that exists in our consciousness also exists throughout nature. He saw the world not as a dead machine, but as a living, striving organism, a single creative force expressing itself both in the unconscious world of rocks and trees and in the conscious world of human thought. For Schelling, mind and nature were 2 sides of the same coin, both expressions of a single, underlying absolute. He tried to bridge the gap between the subjective and the objective. And then came Hegel. He took all these ideas swirling around. Kant's active mind, Fichte's striving ego, and Schelling's unified nature and spirit, and decided to build a complete system out of them. He agreed with his predecessors that reality was fundamentally rational and spiritual, but he felt their explanations were too static. They didn't properly account for change, development, and history. Hegel's genius was to introduce a dynamic method for understanding how a single rational spirit could unfold and develop over time through a process of conflict and resolution. He didn't just want to close the gap between mind and reality. He wanted to tell the entire story of how they came to be one. How did Hegel plan to explain this grand unfolding story of reality? He used a special kind of logic, a method that has become famously, if a little simplistically, known as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now it's worth noting that Hegel himself rarely used these exact three words in this neat little trio. But the concept they represent is absolutely central to his entire philosophy. It's a way of thinking about how ideas, and indeed reality itself, grow and change not in a straight line, but through a process of contradiction and struggle. It is, if you will, a kind of logical waltz, with three distinct steps that lead to a more complex and complete position. Let's start with the thesis. This is our starting point, an initial idea or a state of being. It's a simple, positive statement. For example, let's take the concept of being. It's the most basic idea you can have, just pure, empty existence with no particular qualities, it just is. But if you think about this idea of pure, featureless being for a moment, you'll find it so empty and undefined that it's practically indistinguishable from its opposite. It has no qualities, no form, no content. It is, in essence, the same as nothing. This leads us directly to the next step in our dance. This brings us to the antithesis, the direct opposite or contradiction of our initial thesis. If our thesis was being, its antithesis is nothing. The thesis, when examined, reveals its own internal contradiction and flips over into its opposite. But we can't just stop there, with being on one side and nothing on the other. The human mind and reality itself, according to Hegel, can't stand this kind of unresolved tension. The very act of thinking about being and nothing, how one seems to imply the other, forces us to find a way to reconcile them. We need a new concept that contains the truth of both. This reconciliation is the synthesis. It's a new, higher, and more complex idea that resolves the conflict between the thesis and antithesis by preserving what was true in both of them. In our example, the conflict between pure being and pure nothing is resolved in the concept of becoming. Something that is becoming both is, it has some being, and is not yet what it will be, it contains nothingness. This new synthesis is richer and more concrete than the simple ideas it came from. But the story doesn't end there. This synthesis then becomes a new thesis, which will in turn generate its own antithesis, leading to a new, even richer synthesis. For Hegel, this dialectical engine drives all of history, thought, and reality forward. Hegel laid out his vast philosophical system in a series of formidable books, each tackling a different part of the grand story of spirit's journey to self-knowledge. The most famous, and perhaps the most dazzlingly difficult, is his 1807 work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. This book is a kind of philosophical adventure story. It charts the journey of consciousness, starting from the most basic, naive level of sense certainty, simply pointing at something and saying this, here, now, and follows it through a series of stages. Each stage of consciousness thinks it has grasped the truth, only to discover its own internal contradictions, forcing it to move on to a new, more sophisticated level. The phenomenology is populated with a cast of famous characters, or shapes of consciousness, like the Stoic, the Skeptic, and the Unhappy Consciousness. Perhaps the most famous section is the master-slave dialectic. Here, Hegel describes a life-and-death struggle between two consciousnesses. The winner becomes the master, and the loser, to save their life, becomes the slave. At first, it seems the master has won everything, but Hegel brilliantly shows how the tables turn. The master becomes lazy and dependent on the slave's work, while the slave, through their labor, actively shapes the world and in doing so achieves a deeper sense of self-awareness. It's a powerful metaphor for how recognition and freedom are achieved through struggle and work. If the phenomenology was the story of consciousness, Hegel's science of logic was the blueprint for reality itself. This is where he dives deep into the dialectical process we discussed earlier, starting with the most abstract concepts of being, nothing, and becoming. He attempts to show that the very categories of thought are not just tools we use to understand the world. They are the fundamental structure of the world itself. For Hegel, logic wasn't just about how we think, it was about how things are. He believed that reality is thoroughly rational, and by tracing the logical development of these pure concepts, we are tracing the very skeleton of the universe. Finally, all these threads come together in Hegel's ultimate concept, the absolute spirit or absoluter Geist. This is the endpoint of the entire cosmic and historical journey. Absolute spirit is the universe becoming fully self-aware. It's the point where reality understands itself as a rational, spiritual whole. Hegel believed this final self-knowledge is expressed in three main ways: in art, which grasps the absolute through intuition and images; in religion, which grasps it through faith and stories; and finally, in its highest form, philosophy, which grasps the absolute through pure conceptual thought. For Hegel, his own philosophical system was the moment that spirit finally came to understand itself completely. A modest claim, to be sure. For many philosophers before Hegel, history was just, as a famous historian once said, one damned thing after another. It was a chaotic and often meaningless sequence of wars, famines, and the follies of kings. Hegel, however, looked at the grand sweep of human history and saw something entirely different. He saw a rational process, a slow, difficult, but ultimately purposeful story. And the plot of this story, the central theme driving it forward, was the development and realization of human freedom. He famously declared, "The history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom." Hegel's view of history starts in what he called the Oriental world, in ancient empires like Persia and China. In these societies, he argued, only one person was free, the emperor or the despot. Everyone else was subject to his will. The concept of individual freedom simply didn't exist for the masses. It was a world of unity, but a unity without liberty for the individual. This was the childhood of history, a first necessary stage. But the world spirit, this driving force of history, could not remain at this level. It had to move forward to develop a more complex understanding of freedom. The next great stage unfolded in the classical world of Greece and Rome. Here, Hegel saw a major advance. The Greeks, particularly the Athenians, discovered the idea of citizenship and political freedom. In the Greek city-state, some people were free. Citizens could participate in the life of the police, they could vote and make laws. However, this freedom was not universal. It was dependent on the institution of slavery, and it didn't extend to women or foreigners. The Romans expanded this idea of legal rights, but freedom was still tied to being a Roman citizen, not to being a human being as such. This was the adolescence of freedom, a partial and incomplete realization. The final and highest stage of freedom, according to Hegel, began with the rise of Christianity and reached its culmination in the modern Germanic nations of Europe, particularly Prussia in his own time. Christianity, he argued, introduced the radical idea that every single individual has infinite worth in the eyes of God. This spiritual idea of inner freedom had to be made real in the world. The Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution were crucial steps in this process, translating inner freedom into political and social reality. For Hegel, the modern constitutional state was the ultimate achievement, a place where individual freedom could be reconciled with the universal good of the community. It's a grand, and many would say controversial, narrative. When a philosopher as monumental as Hegel passes away, he doesn't just leave behind a collection of books. He leaves behind an intellectual battlefield. Almost immediately after his death in 1831, his followers split into two rival camps, often called the right Hegelians and the left Hegelians. This division was based on how they interpreted the master's famously ambiguous and complex system, particularly his philosophy of religion and politics. It was like two different groups of people looking at a cloud. One saw a sheep, the other saw a dragon, and both were convinced they were right. The debate they started would shape European thought for the rest of the century. The right Hegelians, also known as the old Hegelians, were the conservative interpreters. They took Hegel's statement